Chapter 49 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. Monks and Mr. Brownlow at length meet. Their conversation, and the intelligence that interrupts it. The twilight was beginning to close in, when Mr. Brownlow alighted from a hackney coach at his own door, and knocked softly. The door being opened, a sturdy man got out of the coach, and stationed himself on one side of the steps, while another man who had been seated on the box dismounted too, and stood upon the other side. At a sign from Mr. Brownlow, they helped out a third man, and taking him between them, hurried him into the house. This man was Monks. They walked in the same manner up the stairs without speaking, and Mr. Brownlow, preceding them, led the way into a back room. At the door of this apartment, Monks, who had ascended with evident reluctance, stopped. The two men looked at the old gentleman, as if for instructions. "He knows the alternative," said Mr. Brownlow. "If he hesitates or moves a finger but as you bid him, drag him into the street, call for the aid of the police, and impeach him as a felon in my name." "How dare you say this of me?" asked Monks. "How dare you urge me to it, young man?" replied Mr. Brownlow, confronting him with a steady look. "Are you mad enough to leave this house? Unhand him. There, sir, you are free to go, and we to follow. But I warn you, by all I hold most solemn and most sacred, that the instant you do I will have you apprehended on a charge of fraud and robbery. I am resolute and immovable. If you are determined to be the same, your blood be upon your own head." "By what authority am I kidnapped in the street, and brought here by these dogs?" asked Monks, looking from one to the other of the men who stood beside him. "By mine," replied Mr. Brownlow. "These persons are indemnified by me. If you complain of being deprived of your liberty, you had power and opportunity to retrieve it as you came along, but you deemed it advisable to remain quiet. I say again, throw yourself for protection on the law. I will appeal to the law too, but when you have gone too far to recede, do not sue to me for leniency, when the power will have passed into other hands, and do not say I plunged you down the gulf into which you rushed yourself." Monks was plainly disconcerted, and alarmed besides. He hesitated. "You will decide quickly," said Mr. Brownlow, with perfect firmness and composure. "If you wish me to prefer my charges publicly, and consign you to a punishment the extent of which, although I can with a shudder foresee, I cannot control, once more I say, you know the way. If not, and you appeal to my forbearance and the mercy of those you have deeply injured, seat yourself without a word in that chair. It has waited for you 2 whole days." Monks muttered some unintelligible words, but wavered still. "You will be prompt," said Mr. Brownlow. "A word from me, and the alternative is gone for ever." Still the man hesitated. "I have not the inclination to parley," said Mr. Brownlow, "and as I advocate the dearest interests of others, I have not the right." "Is there," demanded Monks with a faltering tongue, "is there no middle course?" "None." Monks looked at the old gentleman with an anxious eye, but reading in his countenance nothing but severity and determination, walked into the room, and shrugging his shoulders, sat down. "Lock the door on the outside," said Mr. Brownlow to the attendants, "and come when I ring." The men obeyed, and the two were left alone together. "This is a pretty treatment, sir," said Monks, throwing down his hat and cloak, "from my father's oldest friend." "It is because I was your father's oldest friend, young man," returned Mr. Brownlow. "It is because the hopes and wishes of young and happy years were bound up with him and that fair creature of his blood and kindred who rejoined her God in youth, and left me here a solitary, lonely man. It is because he knelt with me beside his only sister's death-bed when he was yet a boy, on the morning that would, but heaven willed otherwise, have made her my young wife. It is because my seared heart clung to him from that time forth through all his trials and errors, till he died. It is because old recollections and associations filled my heart, and even the sight of you brings with it old thoughts of him. It is because of all these things that I am moved to treat you gently now, yes, Edward Leaford, even now, and blush for your unworthiness who bear the name." "What has the name got to do with it?" asked the other, after contemplating, half in silence and half in dogged wonder, the agitation of his companion. "What is the name to me?" "Nothing," replied Mr. Brownlow, "nothing to you. But it was hers. and even at this distance of time brings back to me, an old man, the glow and thrill which I once felt, only to hear it repeated by a stranger. I am very glad you have changed it—very, very.' 'This is all mighty fine,' said Monks, to retain his assumed designation, after a long silence, during which he had jerked himself in sullen defiance to and fro, and Mr. Brownlow had sat shading his face with his hand. 'But what do you want with me?' 'You have a brother,' said Mr. Brownlow, rousing himself, 'a brother, the whisper of whose name in your ear when I came behind you in the street was, in itself, almost enough to make you accompany me hither, in wonder and alarm.' 'I have no brother,' replied Monks. 'You know I was an only child. Why do you talk to me of brothers? You know that as well as I.' 'Attend to what I do know, and you may not,' said Mr. Brownlow. 'I shall interest you by and by. I know that of the wretched marriage into which my family pride and the most sordid and narrowest of all ambition forced your unhappy father when a mere boy, you were the sole and most unnatural issue.' 'I don't care for hard names,' interrupted Monks, with a jeering laugh. 'You know the fact, and that's enough for me.' 'But I also know,' pursued the old gentleman, 'the misery, the slow torture, the protracted anguish of that ill-assorted union. I know how listlessly and wearily each of that wretched pair dragged on their heavy chain through a world that was poison to them both. I know how cold formalities were succeeded by open taunts, how indifference gave place to dislike, dislike to hate, and hate to loathing, until at last they wrenched the clanking bond asunder, and retiring a wide space apart, carried each a galling fragment, of which nothing but death could break the rivets, to hide it in new society beneath the gayest looks they could assume. Your mother succeeded; she forgot it soon, but it rusted and cankered at your father's heart for years.' 'Well, they were separated,' said Monks. 'And what of that?' 'When they had been separated for some time,' returned Mr. Brownlow, 'and your mother, wholly given up to continental frivolities, had utterly forgotten the young husband 10 good years her junior, who, with prospects blighted, lingered on at home, he fell among new friends. This circumstance, at least, you already know.' 'Not I,' said Monks, turning away his eyes and beating his foot upon the ground, as a man who is determined to deny everything. 'Not I.' 'Your manner, no less than your actions, assures me that you have never forgotten it, or ceased to think of it with bitterness,' returned Mr. Brownlow. 'I speak of 15 years ago, when you were not more than 11 years old, and your father but 31, for he was, I repeat, a boy when his father ordered him to marry. Must I go back to events which cast a shade upon the memory of your parent, or will you spare it, and disclose to me the truth?' 'I have nothing to disclose,' rejoined Monks. 'You must talk on if you will.' 'These new friends, then,' said Mr. Brownlow, 'were a naval officer retired from active service, whose wife had died some half a year before, and left him with 2 children. There had been more, but of all their family, happily but 2 survived. They were both daughters, one a beautiful creature of 19, and the other a mere child of 2 or 3 years old.' 'What's this to me?' asked Monks. 'They resided,' said Mr. Brownlow, without seeming to hear the interruption, 'in a part of the country to which your father in his wandering had repaired, and where he had taken up his abode. Acquaintance, intimacy, friendship, fast followed on each other. Your father was gifted, as few men are. He had his sister's soul and person. As the old officer knew him more and more, he grew to love him. I would that it had ended there. His daughter did the same.' The old gentleman paused. Monks was biting his lips, with his eyes fixed upon the floor. Seeing this, he immediately resumed. 'The end of the year found him contracted, solemnly contracted, to that daughter, the object of the first true ardent only passion of a guileless girl.' 'Your tale is of the longest,' observed Monks, moving restlessly in his chair. 'It is a true tale of grief and trial and sorrow, young man,' returned Mr. Brownlow, 'and such tales usually are. If it were one of unmixed joy and happiness, it would be very brief. At length one of those rich relations to strengthen whose interest and importance your father had been sacrificed, as others are often, it is no uncommon case, died, and to repair the misery he had been instrumental in occasioning, left him his panacea for all griefs—money. It was necessary that he should immediately repair to Rome, whither this man had sped for health, and where he had died, leaving his affairs in great confusion. He went, was seized with mortal illness there, was followed the moment the intelligence reached Paris by your mother, who carried you with her. He died the day after her arrival, leaving no will—no will, so that the whole property fell to her and you." At this part of the recital Monks held his breath, and listened with a face of intense eagerness, though his eyes were not directed towards the speaker. As Mr. Brownlow paused, he changed his position with the air of one who has experienced a sudden relief, and wiped his hot face and hands. "Before he went abroad, and as he passed through London on his way," said Mr. Brownlow slowly, and fixing his eyes upon the other's face, "he came to me." "I never heard of that," interrupted Monks, in a tone intended to appear incredulous, but savouring more of disagreeable surprise. "He came to me, and left with me, among some other things, a picture, a portrait painted by himself, a likeness of this poor girl, which he did not wish to leave behind, and could not carry forward on his hasty journey. He was worn by anxiety and remorse almost to a shadow, talked in a wild distracted way of ruin and dishonour worked by himself, confided to me his intention to convert his whole property, at any loss, into money, and having settled on his wife and you a portion of his recent acquisition, to fly the country. I guessed too well he would not fly alone, and never see it more. Even from me he withheld any more particular confession, promising to write and tell me all, and after that to see me once again, for the last time on earth. Alas, that was the last time. I had no letter, and I never saw him more. I went," said Mr. Brownlow, after a short pause, "I went, when all was over, to the scene of his—I will use the term the world would freely use, for worldly harshness or favour are now alike to him—of his guilty love, resolved that if my fears were realized, that erring child should find one heart and home to shelter and compassionate her. The family had left that part a week before. They had called in such trifling debts as were outstanding, discharged them, and left the place by night. Why or whither, none can tell." Monks drew his breath yet more freely, and looked round with a smile of triumph. "When your brother," said Mr. Brownlow, drawing nearer to the other's chair, "when your brother, a feeble, ragged, neglected child, was cast in my way by a stronger hand than chance, and rescued by me from a life of vice and infamy—" "What?" cried Monks. "By me," said Mr. Brownlow. "I told you I should interest you before long. I say by me. I see that your cunning associate suppressed my name, although, for aught he knew, it would be quite strange to your ears. When he was rescued by me, then, and lay recovering from sickness in my house, his strong resemblance to this picture I have spoken of struck me with astonishment. Even when I first saw him in all his dirt and misery, there was a lingering expression on his face that came upon me like a glimpse of some old friend flashing on one in a vivid dream. I need not tell you he was snared away before I knew his history." "Why not?" asked Monks hastily. "Because you know it well." "I? Denial to me is vain," replied Mr. Brownlow. "I shall show you that I know more than that." "You can't prove anything against me," stammered Monks. "I defy you to do it." "We shall see," returned the old gentleman with a searching glance. "I lost the boy, and no efforts of mine could recover him. Your mother being dead, I knew that you alone could solve the mystery if anybody could. And as when I had last heard of you, you were on your own estate in the West Indies, whither, as you well know, you retired upon your mother's death to escape the consequences of vicious courses here, I made the voyage. You had left it months before, and were supposed to be in London, but no one could tell where. I returned. Your agents had no clue to your residence. You came and went, they said, as strangely as you had ever done, sometimes for days together, and sometimes not for months, keeping to all appearance the same low haunts and mingling with the same infamous herd who had been your associates when a fierce ungovernable boy. I wearied them with new applications. I paced the streets by night and day, but until 2 hours ago all my efforts were fruitless, and I never saw you for an instant." "And now you do see me," said Monks, rising boldly. "What then? Fraud and robbery are high-sounding words, justified, you think, by a fancied resemblance in some young imp to an idle daub of a dead man's. Brother, You don't even know that a child was born of this maudlin pair. You don't even know that.' 'I did not,' replied Mr. Brownlow, rising too. 'But within the last fortnight I have learnt it all. You have a brother, you know it, and him. There was a will which your mother destroyed, leaving the secret and the gain to you at her own death. It contained a reference to some child likely to be the result of this sad connection, which child was born and accidentally encountered by you when your suspicions were first awakened by his resemblance to his father. You repaired to the place of his birth. There existed proofs long suppressed, of his birth and parentage. Those proofs were destroyed by you, and now, in your own words to your accomplice, the Jew, the only proofs of the boy's identity lie at the bottom of the river, and the old hag that received them from the mother is rotting in her coffin. Unworthy son, coward, liar, you who hold your councils with thieves and murderers in dark rooms at night, you whose plots and wiles have brought a violent death upon the head of one worth millions such as you who from your cradle were gall and bitterness to your own father's heart, and in whom all evil passions, vice, and profligacy festered, till they found a vent in a hideous disease which had made your face an index even to your mind. You, Edward Leaford, do you still brave me?' 'No, no, no,' returned the coward, overwhelmed by these accumulated charges. 'Every word,' cried the old gentleman, 'every word that has passed between you and this detested villain is known to me. Shadows on the wall have caught your whispers and brought them to my ear. The sight of the persecuted child has turned vice itself, and given it the courage and almost the attributes of virtue. Murder has been done, to which you were morally, if not really, a party.' 'No, no,' interposed Monks. I know nothing of that. I was going to inquire the truth of the story when you overtook me. I didn't know the cause. I thought it was a common quarrel.' 'It was the partial disclosure of your secrets,' replied Mr. Brownlow. 'Will you disclose the whole?' 'Yes, I will.' 'Set your hand to a statement of truth and facts, and repeat it before witnesses?' 'That I promise too.' 'Remain quietly here until such a document is drawn up, and proceed with me to such a place as I may deem most advisable for the purpose of attesting it.' 'If you insist upon that, I'll do that also,' replied Monks. 'You must do more than that,' said Mr. Brownlow. 'Make restitution to an innocent and unoffending child, for such he is, although the offspring of a guilty and most miserable love. You have not forgotten the provisions of the will. Carry them into execution, so far as your brother is concerned, and then go where you please. In this world you need meet no more.' While Monks was pacing up and down, meditating with dark and evil looks on this proposal and the possibilities of evading it, torn by his fears on the one hand and his hatred on the other, the door was hurriedly unlocked, and a gentleman, Mr. Losberne, entered the room in violent agitation. 'The man will be taken!' he cried. 'He will be taken to-night!' 'The murderer?' asked Mr. Brownlow. 'Yes, yes,' replied the other. 'His dog has been seen lurking about some old haunt, and there seems little doubt that his master either is or will be there under cover of the darkness. Spies are hovering about in every direction. I have spoken to the men who are charged with his capture, and they tell me he cannot escape. A reward of £100 is proclaimed by Government to-night.' 'I will give 50 more,' said Mr. Brownlow, 'and proclaim it with my own lips upon the spot, if I can reach it. Where is Mr. Mayley?' 'Harry, as soon as he had seen your friend here safe in a coach with you, he hurried off to where he heard this,' replied the doctor, 'and mounting his horse, sallied forth to join the first party at some place in the outskirts agreed upon between them.' 'Fagin,' said Mr. Brownlow, 'what of him?' 'When I last heard he had not been taken, but he will be, or is by this time. They're sure of him.' 'Have you made up your mind?' asked Mr. Brownlow in a low voice of Monks. 'Yes,' he replied. 'You will be secret with me?' 'I will. Remain here till I return. It is your only hope of safety.' They left the room, and the door was again locked. 'What have you done?' asked the doctor in a whisper. 'All that I could hope to do, and even more. Coupling the poor girl's intelligence with my previous knowledge, and the result of our good friend's inquiries on the spot, I left him no loophole of escape, and laid bare the whole villainy by which these lights became plain as day. Write and appoint the evening after to-morrow at 7 for the meeting. We shall be down there a few hours before, but shall require rest, especially the young lady, who may have greater need of firmness than either you or I can quite foresee just now. But my blood boils to avenge this poor murdered creature. Which way have they taken?' 'Drive straight to the office, and you'll be in time,' replied Mr. Losberne. 'I will remain here.' The two gentlemen hastily separated, each in a fever of excitement wholly uncontrollable. Chapter 50 of Oliver Twist, by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. Pursuit and Escape. Near to that part of the Thames on which the church at Rotherhithe abuts, where the buildings on the banks are dirtiest, and the vessels on the river are blackest with the dust of colliers and the smoke of close-built, low-roofed houses, there exists the filthiest, the strangest, the most extraordinary of the many localities that are hidden in London, wholly unknown even by name to the great mass of its inhabitants. To reach this place the visitor has to penetrate through a maze of close, narrow, and muddy streets, thronged by the roughest and poorest of waterside people, and devoted to the traffic they may be supposed to occasion. The cheapest and least delicate provisions are heaped in the shops, the coarsest and commonest articles of wearing apparel dangle at the salesman's door, and stream from the house parapet and windows. Jostling with unemployed labourers of the lowest class, ballast heavers, coal whippers, brazen women, ragged children, and the raff and refuse of the river, he makes his way with difficulty along, assailed by offensive sights and smells from the narrow alleys which branch off on the right and left, and deafened by the clash of ponderous waggons that bear great piles of merchandise from the stacks of warehouses that rise from every corner. Arriving at length in streets remoter and less frequented than those through which he has just passed, he walks beneath tottering house-fronts projecting over the pavement, dismantled walls that seem to totter as he passes, chimneys half-crushed, half-hesitating to fall, windows guarded by rusty iron bars that time and dirt have almost eaten away, every imaginable sign of desolation and neglect. In such a neighbourhood, beyond Dockhead in the borough of Southwark, stands Jacob's Island, surrounded by a muddy ditch, 6 or 8 feet deep, and 15 or 20 wide when the tide is in, once called Mill Pond, but known in the days of this story as Folly Ditch. It is a creek or inlet from the Thames, and can always be filled at high water by opening the sluices at the lead mills from which it took its old name. At such times a stranger looking from one of the wooden bridges thrown across it at Mill Lane will see the inhabitants of the houses on either side lowering from their back doors and windows buckets, pails, domestic utensils of all kinds, in which to haul the water up, and when his eye is turned from these operations to the houses themselves, his utmost astonishment will be excited by the scene before him. Crazy wooden galleries common to the backs of half a dozen houses, with holes from which to look upon the slime beneath, windows broken and patched, with poles thrust out on which to dry the linen that is never there, rooms so small, so filthy, so confined, that the air would seem too tainted even for the dirt and squalor which they shelter, wooden chambers thrusting themselves out above the mud and threatening to fall into it, as some have done, dirt-besmeared walls and decaying foundations, every repulsive lineament of poverty, every loathsome indication of filth, rot, and garbage, all these ornament the banks of Folly Ditch. In Jacob's Island the warehouses are roofless and empty, the walls are crumbling down, the windows are windows no more, the doors are falling into the streets, the chimneys are blackened, but they yield no smoke. 30 or 40 years ago, before losses and chancery suits came upon it, it was a thriving place, but now it is a desolate island indeed. The houses have no owners, they are broken open and entered upon by those who have the courage, and there they live and there they die. They must have powerful motives for a secret residence, or be reduced to a destitute condition indeed, who seek a refuge in Jacob's Island. In an upper room of one of these houses, a detached house of fair size, ruinous in other respects, but strongly defended at door and window, of which house the back commanded the ditch in manner already described, there were assembled 3 men, who, regarding each other every now and then with looks expressive of perplexity and expectation, sat for some time in profound and gloomy silence. One of these was Toby Crackit, another Mr. Chitling, and the third a robber of 50 years, whose nose had been almost beaten in some old scuffle, and whose face bore a scar which might probably be traced to the same occasion. This man was a returned transport, and his name was Caggs. "I wish," said Toby, turning to Mr. Chitling, "that you had picked out some other crib when the two old ones got too warm, and had not come here, my fine feller." "Why didn't you, blunderhead?" said Caggs. "Well, I thought you'd have been a little more glad to see me than this," replied Mr. Chitling, with a melancholy air. "Why, lucky young gentleman," said Toby, "when a man keeps himself so very exclusive as I have done, and by that means has a snug house over his head, with nobody a prying and smelling about it. It's rather a startling thing to have the honour of a visit from a young gentleman, however respectable and pleasant a person he may be to play cards with at conveniency, circumstanced as you are. Especially when the exclusive young man has got a friend stopping with him, that's arrived sooner than was expected from foreign parts, and is too modest to want to be presented to the judges on his return," added Mr. Caggs. There was a short silence, after which Toby Crackit, seeming to abandon as hopeless any further effort to maintain his usual devil-may-care swagger, turned to Chitling and said, "When was Fagin took, then?" "Just at dinner time. 2 o'clock this afternoon. Charley and I made our lucky up the washer's chimney, and Bolter got into the empty water butt, head downwards, but his legs were so precious long that they stuck out at the top, and so they took him too. And Bet, poor Bet, she went to see the body, to speak to who it was," replied Chitling, his countenance falling more and more, "and went off mad, screaming and raving, and beating her head against the boards. So they put a straight waistcoat on her, and took her to the hospital, and there she is." "What's come of young Bates?" demanded Caggs. "He hung about, not to come over here afore dark, but he'll be here soon," replied Chitling. "There's nowhere else to go now, for the people at the Cripples are all in custody, and the bar of the Cairn—I went up there to see it with my own eyes—is filled with traps." "This is a smash," observed Toby, biting his lips. "There's more than one'll go at this." "The sessions are on," said Caggs. "If they get the inquest over, and Bolter turns king's evidence, as of course he will, from what he's said already, they can prove Fagin an accessory before the fact, and get the trial on Friday, and he'll swing in 6 days from this, by goat." "You should have heard the people groan," said Chitling. "The officers fought like devils, or they'd have torn him away. He was down once, but they made a ring round him, and forced their way along. You should have seen how he looked about 'em, all muddy and bleeding, and clung to them as if they were his dearest friends. I can see him now, not able to stand upright with the pressing of the mob, and dragging him along amongst them. I can see the people jumping in, one behind another, and snarling with their teeth, and making at him. I can see the blood upon his hair and beard, and hear the cries with which the women worked themselves into the centre of the crowd at the street corner, and swore they'd tear his heart out." The horror-stricken witness of this scene pressed his hands upon his ears, and with his eyes closed got up and paced violently to and fro, like one distracted. While he was thus engaged, and the two men sat by in silence with their eyes fixed upon the floor, a pattering noise was heard upon the stairs, and Sikes's dog bounded into the room. They ran to the window, downstairs, and into the street. The dog had jumped in at an open window. He made no attempt to follow them, nor was his master to be seen. "What's the meaning of this?" said Toby, when they had returned. "He can't be coming here. I hope not." "If he was coming here, he'd have come with the dog," said Caggs, stooping down to examine the animal, who lay panting on the floor. "Here, give us some water for him. He's run himself faint." "He's drunk it all up, every drop," said Chitling, after watching the dog some time in silence. "Covered with mud, lame, half blind. He must have come a long way." "Where can he have come from?" exclaimed Toby. "He's been to the other kens, of course, and finding them filled with strangers, come on here, where he's been many a time and often. But where can he have come from first, and how comes he here alone without the other?" "None of them call the murderer by his old name. He can't have made away with himself. What do you think?" said Chitling. Toby shook his head. "If he had," said Caggs, "the dog would want to lead us away to where he did it. No, I think he's got out of the country, and left the dog behind. He must have given him the slip somehow,
or he wouldn't be so easy."
This solution, appearing the most probable one, was adopted as a right. The dog, creeping under a chair, coiled himself up to sleep, without more notice from anybody. It being now dark, the shutter was closed, and a candle lighted and placed upon the table. The terrible events of the last 2 days had made a deep impression on all three, increased by the danger and uncertainty of their own position. They drew their chairs closer together, starting at every sound. They spoke little, and that in whispers, and were as silent and awe-stricken as if the remains of the murdered woman lay in the next room. They had sat thus some time when suddenly was heard a hurried knocking at the door below.
"Young Bates,"
said Caggs, looking angrily round, to check the fear he felt himself. The knocking came again. No, it wasn't he. He never knocked like that. Crackit went to the window, and shaking all over, drew in his head. There was no need to tell them who it was. His pale face was enough. The dog, too, was on the alert in an instant, and ran whining to the door. "We must let him in," he said, taking up the candle. "Isn't there any help for it?" asked the other man, in a hoarse voice. "None. He must come in."
"Don't leave us in the dark,"
said Caggs, taking down a candle from the chimney-piece, and lighting it with such a trembling hand that the knocking was twice repeated before he had finished. Crackit went down to the door, and returned followed by a man with the lower part of his face buried in a handkerchief, and another tied over his head under his hat. He drew them slowly off. Blanched face, sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, beard of 3 days' growth, wasted flesh, short, thick breath. It was the very ghost of Sikes. He laid his hand upon a chair which stood in the middle of the room, but shuddering as he was about to drop into it, and seeming to glance over his shoulder, dragged it back close to the wall, as close as it would go, and ground it against it, and sat down. Not a word had been exchanged. He looked from one to another in silence. If an eye were furtively raised and met his, it was instantly averted. When his hollow voice broke silence, they all three started. They seemed never to have heard its tones before.
"How came that dog here?" he asked.
"Alone, 3 hours ago."
"To-night's paper says that Fagin's took. Is it true or a lie?"
"True."
They were silent again. "Damn you all," said Sikes, passing his hand across his forehead. "Have you nothing to say to me?"
There was an uneasy movement among them, but nobody spoke.
"You that keep this house," said Sikes, turning his face to Crackit, "do you mean to sell me, or let me lie here till this hunt is over?"
"You may stop here if you think it's safe," returned the person addressed, after some hesitation. Sikes carried his eyes slowly up the wall behind him, rather trying to turn his head than actually doing it, and said, "Is the body—is it buried?" They shook their heads.
"Why isn't it?" he retorted, with the same glance behind him. "What do they keep such ugly things above ground for? Who's that knocking?"
Crackit intimated, by a motion of his hand as he left the room, that there was nothing to fear, and directly came back with Charley Bates behind him. Sikes sat opposite the door, so that the moment the boy entered the room he encountered his figure. "Toby," said the boy, falling back, as Sikes turned his eyes towards him, "why didn't you tell me this downstairs?" There had been something so tremendous in the shrinking of the three that the wretched man was willing to propitiate even this lad. Accordingly he nodded, and made as though he would shake hands with him. "Let me go to some other room," said the boy, retreating still farther.
"Charley," said Sikes, stepping forward, Don't you know me?"
"Don't come nearer me," answered the boy, still retreating, and looking with horror in his eyes upon the murderer's face. "You monster!" The man stopped half-way, and they looked at each other, but Sikes's eyes sunk gradually to the ground. "Witness you free!" cried the boy, shaking his clenched fist, and becoming more and more excited as he spoke. "Witness you free! I'm not afraid of him. If they come in here after him, I'll give him up. I will. I'll tell you out at once. He may kill me for it if he likes, or if he dares, but if I am here, I'll give him up. I'd give him up if he was to be boiled alive. Murderer, help! If there's the pluck of a man among you three, you'll help me. Murderer, help! Down with him!" Pouring out these cries, and accompanying them with violent gesticulation, the boy actually threw himself single-handed upon the strong man, and in the intensity of his energy and the suddenness of his surprise brought him heavily to the ground. The three spectators seemed quite stupefied. They offered no interference, and the boy and man rolled on the ground together, the former heedless of the blows that showered upon him, wrenching his hands tighter and tighter in the garments about the murderer's breast, and never ceasing to call for help with all his might. The contest, however, was too unequal to last long. Sikes had him down, and his knee was on his throat, when Crackit pulled him back with a look of alarm, and pointed to the window. There were lights gleaming below, voices in loud and earnest conversation, the tramp of hurried footsteps, and endless they seemed in number, crossing the nearest wooden bridge. One man on horseback seemed to be among the crowd, for there was the noise of hoofs rattling on the uneven pavement. The gleam of lights increased, the footsteps came more thickly and noisily on. Then came a loud knocking at the door, and then a hoarse murmur from such a multitude of angry voices as would have made the boldest quail. "Help!" shrieked the boy in a voice that rent the air. "He's here! Break down the door!" "In the king's name!" cried the voices without, and the hoarse cry arose again, but louder. "Break down the door!" screamed the boy. "I tell you they'll never open it! Run straight to the room where the light is! Break down the door!" Strokes thick and heavy rattled upon the door and lower window shutters as he ceased to speak, and a loud huzzah burst from the crowd, giving the listener for the first time some adequate idea of its immense extent. "Open the door to some place where I can lock this screeching hell babe!" cried Sikes fiercely, running to and fro, and dragging the boy now as easily as if he were an empty sack. "That door! Quick!" He flung him in, bolted it, and turned the key. "Is the downstairs door fast?" "Double locked and chained," replied Crackit, who with the other two men still remained quite helpless and bewildered. "The panels, are they strong?" "Lined with sheet iron." "And the windows too?" "Yes, and the windows." "Damn you!" cried the desperate ruffian, throwing up the sash and menacing the crowd. "Do your worst! I'll cheat you yet!" Of all the terrific yells that ever fell on mortal ears, none could exceed the cry of the infuriated throng. Some shouted to those who were nearest to set the house on fire, others roared to the officers to shoot him dead. Among them all none showed such fury as the man on horseback, who, throwing himself out of the saddle and bursting through the crowd as if he were parting water, cried beneath the window in a voice that rose above all others, "20 guineas to the man who brings a ladder!" The nearest voices took up the cry, and hundreds echoed it. Some called for ladders, some for sledge-hammers, some ran with torches to and fro as if to seek them, and still came back and roared again. Some spent their breath in impotent curses and execrations, some pressed forward with the ecstasy of madmen, and thus impeded the progress of those below. Some amongst the boldest attempted to climb up by the water-spout and crevices in the wall, and all waved to and fro in the darkness beneath, like a field of corn moved by an angry wind, and joined from time to time in one loud furious roar. "The tide!" cried the murderer, as he staggered back into the room and shut the faces out. "The tide was in when I came up. Give me a rope, a long rope. They're all in front. I may drop into the folly ditch and clear off that way. Give me a rope, or I shall do 3 more murders and kill myself." The panic-stricken men pointed to where such articles were kept. The murderer, hastily selecting the longest and strongest cord, hurried up to the house-top. All the windows in the rear of the house had been long ago bricked up, except one small trap in the room where the boy was locked, and that was too small even for the passage of his body. But from this aperture he had never ceased to call on those without to guard the back, and thus, when the murderer emerged at last on the house-top, by the door in the roof, a loud shout proclaimed the fact to those in front, who immediately began to pour round, pressing upon each other in an unbroken stream. He planted a board, which he had carried up with him for the purpose, so firmly against the door that it must be a matter of great difficulty to open it from the inside, and creeping over the tiles, looked over the low parapet. The water was out, and the ditch a bed of mud. The crowd had been hushed during these few moments, watching his motions and doubtful of his purpose, but the instant they perceived it and knew it was defeated, they raised a cry of triumphant execration to which all their previous shouting had been whispers. Again and again it rose. Those who were at too great a distance to know its meaning took up the sound. It echoed and re-echoed. It seemed as though the whole city had poured its population out to curse him. On pressed the people from the front, on, in a strong struggling current of angry faces, and here and there a glaring torch to lighten them up, and to show them out in all their wrath and passion. The houses on the opposite side of the ditch had been entered by the mob. Sashes were thrown up or torn bodily out. There were tiers and tiers of faces at every window, cluster upon cluster of people clinging to every housetop. Each little bridge, and there were three in sight, bent beneath the weight of the crowd upon it. Still the current poured on to find some nook or hole from which to vent their shouts, and only for an instant see the wretch. "They have him now!" cried a man on the nearest bridge. "Hurrah!" The crowd grew light with uncovered heads, and again the shout uprose. "I will give £50," cried an old gentleman from the same quarter, "to the man who takes him alive. I will remain here till he comes to ask me for it." There was another roar. At this moment the word was passed among the crowd that the door was forced at last, and that he who had first called for the ladder had mounted into the room. The stream abruptly turned as this intelligence ran from mouth to mouth, and the people at the window, seeing those upon the bridges pouring back, quitted their stations, and running into the street, joined the concourse that now thronged pell-mell to the spot they had left, each man crushing and striving with his neighbour, and all panting with impatience to get near the door, and look upon the criminal as the officers brought him out. The cries and shrieks of those who were pressed almost to suffocation, or trampled down and trodden under foot in the confusion, were dreadful. The narrow ways were completely blocked up, and at this time, between the rush of some to regain the space in the front of the house, and the unavailing struggles of others to extricate themselves from the mass, the immediate attention was distracted from the murderer, although the universal eagerness for his capture was, if possible, increased. The man had shrunk down, thoroughly quelled by the ferocity of the crowd and the impossibility of escape; but seeing this sudden change with no less rapidity than it had occurred, he sprang upon his feet, determined to make one last effort for his life by dropping into the ditch, and, at the risk of being stifled, endeavouring to creep away in the darkness and confusion. Roused to new strength and energy, and stimulated by the noise within the house which announced that an entrance had really been effected, he set his foot against the stack of chimneys, fastened one end of the rope tightly and firmly round it, and with the other made a strong running noose by the aid of his hands and his teeth almost in a second. He could let himself down by the cord to within a less distance of the ground than his own height, and had his knife ready in his hand to cut it then, and drop. At the very instant when he brought the loop over his head, previous to slipping it beneath his armpits, and when the old gentleman before mentioned, who had clung so tight to the railings of the bridge as to resist the force of the crowd, and retain his position, earnestly warned those about him that the man was about to lower himself down, at that very instant the murderer, looking behind him on the roof, threw his arms above his head, and uttered a yell of terror. "The eyes again!" he cried in an unearthly screech. Staggering as if struck by lightning, he lost his balance and tumbled over the parapet. The noose was on his neck. It ran up with his weight, tight as a bowstring, and swift as the arrow it speeds. He fell for 35 feet. There was a sudden jerk, a terrific convulsion of the limbs, and there he hung, with the open knife clenched in his stiffening hand. The old chimney quivered with the shock, but stood it bravely. The murderer swung lifeless against the wall, and the boy, thrusting aside the dangling body which obscured his view, called to the people to come and take him out for God's sake. A dog, which had lain concealed till now, ran backwards and forwards on the parapet with a dismal howl, and, collecting himself for a spring, jumped for the dead man's shoulders. Missing his aim, he fell into the ditch, turning completely over as he went, and, striking his head against a stone, dashed out his brains. End of chapter 50.
Chapter 51 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. Affording an explanation of more mysteries than one, and comprehending a proposal of marriage with no word of settlement or pin money. The events narrated in the last chapter were yet but 2 days old when Oliver found himself at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in a travelling carriage rolling fast towards his native town. Mrs. Maylie and Rose and Mrs. Bedwin and the good doctor were with him, and Mr. Brownlow followed in a post-chaise, accompanied by one other person whose name had not been mentioned. They had not talked much upon the way, for Oliver was in a flutter of agitation and uncertainty, which deprived him of the power of collecting his thoughts, and almost his speech, and appeared to have scarcely less effect upon his companions, who shared it in at least an equal degree. He and the two ladies had been carefully made acquainted by Mr. Brownlow with the nature of the admissions which had been forced from monks, and although they knew the object of their present journey was to complete the work which had been so well begun, still the whole matter was enveloped in enough of doubt and mystery to leave them in endurance of the most intense suspense. The same kind friend had, with Mr. Losburne's assistance, cautiously stopped all channels of communications through which they could receive intelligence of the dreadful occurrences that had so recently taken place. It was quite true, he said, that they must know them before long, but it might be at a better time than the present, and it could not be at a worse. So they travelled on in silence, each busied with reflections on the object which had brought them together, and no one disposed to give utterance to the thoughts which crowded upon all. But if Oliver, under these influences, had remained silent while they journeyed towards his birthplace by a road he had never seen, how the whole current of his recollections ran back to old times, and what a crowd of emotions were wakened up in his breast when they turned into that which he had traversed on foot, a poor, houseless, wandering boy, without a friend to help him or a roof to shelter his head. "See there, there!" cried Oliver, eagerly clasping the hand of Rose and pointing out at the carriage window. "That's the stile I came over. There are the hedges I crept behind, for fear any one should overtake me and force me back. Yonder is the path across the field, leading to the old house where I was a little child. Oh, Dick, Dick, my dear old friend, if I could only see you now!" "You will see him soon," replied Rose, gently taking his folded hands between her own. "You shall tell him how happy you are, and how rich you have grown, and that in all your happiness you have none so great as the coming back to make him happy too." "Yes, yes," said Oliver. "And we will take him away from here, and have him clothed and taught, and send him to some quiet country place where he may grow strong and well, shall we?" Rose nodded yes, for the boy was smiling through such happy tears that she could not speak. "You will be kind and good to him, for you are to every one," said Oliver. "It will make you cry, I know, to hear what he can tell. But never mind, it will be all over, and you will smile again. I know that too, to think how changed he is. You did the same with me. He said, 'God bless you,' to me when I ran away," cried the boy with a burst of affectionate emotion. "And I will say, 'God bless you' now, and show him how I love him for it." As they approached the town, and at length drove through its narrow streets, it became matter of no small difficulty to restrain the boy within reasonable bounds. There was Sowerberry's, the undertaker's, just as it used to be, only smaller and less imposing in appearance than he remembered it. There were the well-known shops and houses, with almost every one of which he had some slight incident connected. There was Gamfield's cart, the very cart he used to have, standing at the old public-house door. There was the workhouse, the dreary prison of his youthful days, with its dismal windows frowning upon the street. There was the same lean porter standing at the gate, at sight of whom Oliver involuntarily shrunk back, and then laughed at himself for being so foolish, then cried, and then laughed again. There were scores of faces at the doors and windows that he knew quite well. There was nearly everything as if he had left it but yesterday, and all his recent life had been but a happy dream. But it was pure, earnest, joyful reality. They drove straight to the door of the chief hotel, which Oliver used to stare up at with awe, and think a mighty palace, but which had somehow fallen off in grandeur and size. And here was Mr. Grimwig all ready to receive them, kissing the young lady, and the old one too, when they got out of the coach, as if he were the grandfather of the whole party, all smiles and kindness, and not offering to eat his head, no, not once, not even when he contradicted a very old post-boy about the nearest road to London, and maintained he knew it best, though he had only once come that way, and that time fast asleep. There was dinner prepared, and there were bedrooms ready, and everything was arranged as if by magic. Notwithstanding all this, when the hurry of the first half-hour was over, the same silence and constraint prevailed that had marked their journey down. Mr. Brownlow did not join them at dinner, but remained in a separate room. The two other gentlemen hurried in and out with anxious faces, and during the short intervals when they were present, conversed apart. Once Mrs. Maylie was called away, and after being absent for nearly an hour, returned with eyes swollen and weeping. All these things made Rose and Oliver, who were not in any new secrets, nervous and uncomfortable. They sat wondering in silence, or if they exchanged a few words, spoke in whispers, as if they were afraid to hear the sound of their own voices. At length, when 9 o'clock had come, and they began to think they were to hear no more that night, Mr. Losburn and Mr. Grimwig entered the room, followed by Mr. Brownlow and a man whom Oliver almost shrieked with surprise to see, for they told him it was his brother, and it was the same man he had met at the market town, and seen looking in with Fagin at the window of his little room. Monks cast a look of hate, which even then he could not dissemble, at the astonished boy, and sat down near the door. Mr. Brownlow, who had papers in his hand, walked to a table near which Rose and Oliver were seated. "This is a painful task," said he, "but these declarations, which have been signed in London before many gentlemen, must be, in substance, repeated here. I would have spared you the degradation, but we must hear them from your own lips before we part, and you know why." "Go on," said the person addressed, turning away his face. "Quick, I have almost done enough, I think. Don't keep me here." "This child," said Mr. Brownlow, drawing Oliver to him, and laying his hand upon his head, "is your half-brother, the illegitimate son of your father, my dear friend Edwin Leaford, by poor young Agnes Fleming, who died in giving him birth." "Yes," said Monks, scowling at the trembling boy, the beating of whose heart he might have heard. "That is the bastard child." "The term you use," said Mr. Brownlow sternly, "is a reproach to those long since passed beyond the feeble censures of the world. It reflects disgrace on no one living, except you who use it. Let that pass. He was born in this town." "In the workhouse of this town," was the sullen reply. "You have the story there." He pointed impatiently to the papers as he spoke. "I must have it here too," said Mr. Brownlow, looking round upon the listeners. "Listen, then, you," returned Monks. "His father, being taken ill at Rome, was joined by his wife, my mother, from whom he had been long separated, who went from Paris and took me with her, to look after his property, for what I know, for she had no great affection for him, nor he for her. He knew nothing of us, for his senses were gone, and he slumbered on till next day, when he died. Among the papers in his desk were two, dated on the night his illness first came on, directed to yourself." He addressed himself to Mr. Brownlow, "and enclosed in a few short lines to you, with an intimation on the cover of the package that it was not to be forwarded till after he was dead. One of these papers was a letter to this girl Agnes, the other a will." "What of the letter?" asked Mr. Brownlow. "The letter? A sheet of paper crossed and crossed again, with a penitent confession, and prayers to God to help her. He had palmed a tale on the girl that some secret mystery, to be explained one day, prevented his marrying her just then, and so she had gone on, trusting patiently to him, until she trusted too far, and lost what none could ever give her back. She was at that time within a few months of her confinement. He told her all that he meant to do, to hide her shame, if he had lived, and prayed her, if he died, not to curse his memory, or to think the consequences of their sin would be visited on her or their young child, for all the guilt was his. He reminded her of the day he had given her the little locket and the ring with her Christian name engraved upon it, and a blank left for that which he hoped one day to have bestowed upon her, prayed her yet to keep it, and wear it next her heart, as she had done before, and then ran on wildly in the same words over and over again, as if he had gone distracted. I believe he had." "The will?" said Mr. Brownlow, as Oliver's tears fell fast. Monks was silent. "The will," said Mr. Brownlow, speaking for him, "was in the same spirit as the letter. He talked of miseries which his wife had brought upon him, of the rebellious disposition, vice, malice, and premature bad passions of you, his only son, who had been trained to hate him, and left you and your mother each an annuity of £800. The bulk of his property he divided into 2 equal portions, one for Agnes Fleming, and the other for their child, if he should be born alive and ever come of age. If it were a girl, it was to inherit the money unconditionally; if a boy, only on the stipulation that in his minority he should never have stained his name with any public act of dishonour, meanness, cowardice, or wrong. He did this, he said, to mark his confidence in the other, and his conviction, only strengthened by approaching death, that the child would share her gentle heart and noble nature. If he were disappointed in this expectation, then the money was to come to you; for then, and not till then, when both children were equal, would he recognise your prior claim upon his purse, who had none upon his heart, but had, from an infant, repulsed them with coldness and aversion. "My mother," said Monks in a louder tone,
did what a woman should have done. She burnt his will. The letter never reached its destination, but that and other proofs she kept, in case they ever tried to lie away the blot. The girl's father had the truth from her with every aggravation that her violent hate—I love her for it now—could add. Goaded by shame and dishonour, he fled with his children to a remote corner of Wales, changing his very name that his friends might never know of his retreat, and there, no great while afterwards, he was found dead in his bed. The girl had left her home in secret some weeks before. He had searched for her on foot in every town and village near. It was on the night when he returned home, assured that she had destroyed herself to hide her shame and his, that his old heart broke. There was a short silence here, until Mr. Brownlow took up the thread of the narrative. Years after this, he said, this man's, Edward Learford's, mother came to me. He had left her when only 18, robbed her of jewels and money, gambled, squandered, forged, and fled to London, where for 2 years he had associated with the lowest outcasts. She was sinking under a painful and incurable disease, and wished to recover him before she died. Inquiries were set on foot, and strict searches made. They were unavailing for a long time, but ultimately successful, and he went back with her to France. There she died, said Monks, after a lingering illness, and on her deathbed she bequeathed these secrets to me, together with her unquenchable and deadly hatred of all whom they involved, though she need not have left me that, for I had inherited it long before. She would not believe that the girl had destroyed herself and the child too, but was filled with the impression that a male child had been born and was alive. I swore to her, if ever it crossed my path, to hunt it down, never to let it rest, to pursue it with the bitterest and most unrelenting animosity, to vent upon it the hatred that I deeply felt, and to spit upon the empty vaunt of that insulting will by dragging it, if I could, to the very gallows foot. She was right. He came in my way at last. I began well, and but for babbling drabs I would have finished as I began. As the villain folded his arms tight together, and muttered curses on himself in the impotence of baffled malice, Mr. Brownlow turned to the terrified group beside him, and explained that the Jew, who had been his old accomplice and confidant, had a large reward for keeping Oliver ensnared, of which some part was to be given up in the event of his being rescued, and that a dispute on this head had led to their visit to the country house for the purpose of identifying him. "The locket and ring?" said Mr. Brownlow, turning to Monks. "I bought them from the man and woman I told you of, who stole them from the nurse, who stole them from the corpse," answered Monks without raising his eyes. "You know what became of them." Mr. Brownlow merely nodded to Mr. Grimwig, who, disappearing with great alacrity, shortly returned, pushing in Mrs. Bumble and dragging her unwilling consort after him. "Do my eyes deceive me?" cried Mr. Bumble with ill-feigned enthusiasm. "Or is that little Oliver? Oh, Oliver, if you knew how I've been a-grieving for you—" "Hold your tongue, fool," murmured Mrs. Bumble. "It's nature, Mrs. Bumble," remonstrated the workhouse master. "Can't I be supposed to feel, I, as brought him up parochially, when I see him a-sitting here among ladies and gentlemen of the very affablest description? I always loved that boy as if he'd been my own grandfather," said Mr. Bumble, halting for an appropriate comparison. "Master Oliver, my dear, you remember the blessed gentleman in the white waistcoat? Ah, he went to heaven last week, in a oak coffin with plated handles, Oliver." "Come, sir," said Mr. Grimwig tartly, "suppress your feelings." "I will do my endeavours, sir," replied Mr. Bumble. "How do you do, sir? I hope you are very well." This salutation was addressed to Mr. Brownlow, who had stepped up to within a short distance of the respectable couple. He inquired, as he pointed to Monks, "Do you know that person?" "No," replied Mrs. Bumble flatly. "Perhaps you don't," said Mr. Brownlow, addressing her spouse. "I never saw him in my life," said Mr. Bumble. "Nor sold him anything, perhaps?" "No," replied Mrs. Bumble. "You never had, perhaps, a certain gold locket and ring?" said Mr. Brownlow. "Certainly not," replied the matron. "Why are we brought here to answer to such nonsense as this?" Again Mr. Brownlow nodded to Mr. Grimwig, and again that gentleman limped away with extraordinary readiness. But not again did he return with a stout man and wife, for this time he led in 2 palsied women, who shook and tottered as they walked.
"You shut the door the night old Sally died," said the foremost one, raising her shrivelled hand, "but you couldn't shut out the sound, nor stop the chinks." "No, no," said the other, looking round her and wagging her toothless jaws. "No, no, no. We heard her try to tell you what she'd done, and saw you take the paper from her hand, and watched you two next day to the pawnbroker's shop," said the first. "Yes," added the second, "and there was a locket and gold ring. We found that out, and saw it given you. We were by. Oh, we were by." "And we know more than that," resumed the first, "for she told us often long ago that the young mother had told her that, feeling she would never get over it, she was on her way, at the time that she was taken ill, to die near the grave of the father of the child."
Would you like to see the pawnbroker himself?" asked Mr. Grimwig, with a motion towards the door.
"No," replied the woman. "If he"—she pointed to Monks—"has been coward enough to confess, as I see he has, and you have sounded all these hags till you have found the right ones, I have nothing more to say. I did sell them, and they're where you'll never get them. What then?" "Nothing," replied Mr. Brownlow, "except that it remains for us to take care that neither of you is employed in a situation of trust again. You may leave the room."
"I hope," said Mr. Bumble, looking about him with great ruefulness, as Mr. Grimwig disappeared with the two old women, "I hope that this unfortunate little circumstance will not deprive me of my parochial office."
"Indeed it will," replied Mr. Brownlow. "You may make up your mind to that, and think yourself well off besides."
"It was all Mrs. Bumble. She would do it," urged Mr. Bumble, first looking round to ascertain that his partner had left the room.
"That is no excuse," replied Mr. Brownlow. "You were present on the occasion of the destruction of these trinkets, and indeed are the more guilty of the two in the eye of the law, for the law supposes that your wife acts under your direction."
"If the law supposes that," said Mr. Bumble, squeezing his hat emphatically in both hands, "the law is an ass—a idiot. If that is the eye of the law is a bachelor, and the worst I wish the law is, that his eye may be opened by experience. By experience."
Laying great stress on the repetition of these two words, Mr. Bumble fixed his hat on very tight, and putting his hands in his pockets, followed his helpmate downstairs.
"Young lady," said Mr. Brownlow, turning to Rose,
"give me your hand. Do not tremble. You need not fear to hear the few remaining words we have to say." "If they have—I do not know how they can, but if they have any reference to me," said Rose, "pray let me hear them at some other time. I have not strength or spirits now."
"Nay," returned the old gentleman, drawing her arm through his, "you have more fortitude than this, I am sure. Do you know this young lady, sir?" "Yes," replied Monks.
"I never saw you before," said Rose faintly.
"I have seen you often," returned Monks.
"The father of the unhappy Agnes had two daughters," said Mr. Brownlow. "What was the fate of the other—the child?"
"The child," replied Monks, "when her father died in a strange place, in a strange name, without a letter, book, or scrap of paper that yielded the faintest clue by which his friends or relatives could be traced, the child was taken by some wretched cottagers, who reared it as their own."
"Go on," said Mr. Brownlow, signing to Mrs. Maylie to approach. "Go on." "You couldn't find the spot to which these people had repaired," said Mr. Monks. "But where friendship fails, hatred will often force a way. My mother found it, after a year of cunning search. Aye, and found the child." "She took it, did she?" "No. The people were poor, and began to sicken—at least the man did—of their fine humanity. So she left it with him, giving them a small present of money which would not last long, and promised more which she never meant to send. She didn't quite rely, however, on their discontent and poverty for the child's unhappiness, but told the history of the sister's shame, with such alterations as suited her, bade them to take good heed of the child, for she came of bad blood, and told them she was illegitimate, and sure to go wrong at one time or other. The circumstances countenanced all this, the people believed it, and there the child dragged on an existence, miserable enough even to satisfy us, until a widow lady, residing then at Chester, saw the girl by chance, pitied her, and took her home. There was some cursed spell, I think, against us, for in spite of all our efforts she remained there and was happy. I lost sight of her 2 or 3 years ago, and saw her no more until a few months back." "Do you see her now?" "Yes.
leaning on your arm.
"But none the less my niece," cried Mrs. Maylie, folding the fainting girl in her arms. "Not the less my dearest child. I could not lose her now for all the treasures of the world. My sweet companion, my own dear girl." "The only friend I ever had," cried Rose, clinging to her. "The kindest, best of friends. My heart will burst. I cannot bear all this." "You have borne more, and have been through all the best and gentlest creature that ever shed happiness on every one she knew," said Mrs. Maylie, embracing her tenderly. "Come, come, my love, remember who this is who waits to clasp you in his arms, poor child. See here, look, look, my dear." "Not aunt," cried Oliver, throwing his arms about her neck. "I'll never call her aunt. Sister, my own dear sister, that something taught my heart to love so dearly from the first. Rose, dear darling Rose."
Let the tears which fell, and the broken words which were exchanged in the long close embrace between the orphans, be sacred. A father, sister, and mother were gained and lost in that one moment. Joy and grief were mingled in the cup, but there were no bitter tears, for even grief itself arose so softened, and clothed in such sweet and tender recollections, that it became a solemn pleasure, and lost all character of pain. They were a long, long time alone. A soft tap at the door at length announced that some one was without. Oliver opened it, glided away, and gave place to Harry Maylie. "I know it all," he said, taking a seat beside the lovely girl. "Dear Rose, I know it all. I am not here by accident," he added after a lengthened silence, "nor have I heard all this to night, for I knew it yesterday, only yesterday. Do you guess that I have come to remind you of a promise?" "Stay," said Rose. "You do know all?" "All. You gave me leave, at any time within a year, to renew the subject of our last discourse." "I did. Not to press you to alter your determination," pursued the young man, "but to hear you repeat it, if you would. I was to lay whatever of station or fortune I might possess at your feet, and if you still adhered to your former determination, I pledged myself by no word or act to seek to change it." "The same reasons which influenced me then will influence me now," said Rose firmly. "If I ever owed a strict and rigid duty to her whose goodness saved me from a life of indigence and suffering, when should I ever feel it as I should to-night? It is a struggle," said Rose, "but one I am proud to make. It is a pang, but one my heart shall bear." "The disclosure of to-night—" Harry began. "The disclosure of to-night," replied Rose softly, "leaves me in the same position with reference to you as that in which I stood before." "You harden your heart against me, Rose," urged her lover. "Oh, Harry, Harry," said the young lady, bursting into tears, "I wish I could, and spare myself this pain." "Then why inflict it on yourself?" said Harry, taking her hand. "Think, dear Rose, think what you have heard to-night." "And what have I heard? What have I heard?" cried Rose. "That a sense of his disgrace so worked upon my own father that he shunned all. There, we have said enough, Harry, we have said enough." "Not yet, not yet," said the young man, detaining her as she rose. "My hopes, my wishes, prospects, feeling, every thought in life except my love for you, have undergone a change. I offer you now no distinction among a bustling crowd, no mingling with a world of malice and detraction, where the blood is called into honest cheeks by aught but real disgrace and shame; but a home, a heart and home. Yes, my dearest Rose, and those alone, are all I have to offer." "What do you mean?" she faltered. "I mean but this, that when I left you last, I left with a firm determination to level all fancied barriers between yourself and me, resolved that if my world could not be yours, I would make yours mine; that no pride of birth should curl the lip at you, for I would turn from it. This I have done. Those who have shrunk from me because of this have shrunk from you, and proved you so far right. Such power and patronage, such relatives of influence and rank, as smiled upon me then, look coldly now. But there are smiling fields and waving trees in England's richest county, and by one village church—mine, Rose, my own—there stands a rustic dwelling, which you can make me prouder of than all the hopes I have renounced, measured 1,000-fold. This is my rank and station now, and here I lay it down." "It's a trying thing waiting supper for lovers," said Mr. Grimwig, waking up and pulling his pocket-handkerchief from over his head.
Truth to tell, the supper had been waiting a most unreasonable time. Neither Mrs. Maylie, nor Harry, nor Rose, who all came in together, could offer a word in extenuation.
"I had serious thoughts of eating my head to-night," said Mr. Grimwig, "for I began to think I should get nothing else. I'll take the liberty, if you'll allow me, of saluting the bride that is to be."
Mr. Grimwig lost no time in carrying this notice into effect upon the blushing girl, and the example, being contagious, was followed both by the doctor and Mr. Brownlow. Some people affirmed that Harry Maylie had been observed to set it, originally in a dark adjoining room, but the best authorities consider this downright scandal, he being young and a clergyman. "Oliver, my child," said Mrs. Maylie, "where have you been? And why do you look so sad? There are tears stealing down your face at this moment. What is the matter?" This is a world of disappointment, often to the hopes we most cherish, and the hopes that do our nature the greatest honour. Poor Dick was dead. End of chapter 51. Chapter 52 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. Fagin's last night alive. The court was paved from floor to roof with human faces. Inquisitive and eager eyes peered from every inch of space, from the rail before the dock, away to the sharpest angle of the smallest corner in the galleries. All looks were fixed upon one man, Fagin. Before him and behind, above, below, on the right and on the left, he seemed to stand surrounded by a firmament all bright with gleaming eyes. He stood there in all this glare of living light, with one hand resting on the wooden slab before him, the other held to his ear, and his head thrust forward to enable him to catch with greater distinctness every word that fell from the presiding judge, who was delivering his charge to the jury. At times he turned his eyes sharply upon them, to observe the effect of the slightest feather-weight in his favour, and when the points against him were stated with terrible distinctness, looked towards his counsel, in mute appeal that he would, even then, urge something in his behalf. Beyond these manifestations of anxiety he stirred not hand or foot. He had scarcely moved since the trial began, and now that the judge ceased to speak, he still remained in the same strained attitude of close attention, with his gaze bent upon him, as though he listened still. A slight bustle in the court recalled him to himself. Looking round, he saw that the jurymen had turned together to consider their verdict. As his eyes wandered to the gallery, he could see the people rising above each other to see his face, some hastily applying their glasses to their eyes, and others whispering their neighbours with looks expressive of abhorrence. A few there were who seemed unmindful of him, and looked only to the jury in impatient wonder how they could delay. But in no one face, not even among the women, of whom there were many there, could he read the faintest sympathy with himself, or any feeling but one of all-absorbing interest that he should be condemned. As he saw all this in one bewildered glance, the death-like stillness came again, and looking back he saw that the jurymen had turned towards the judge. Hush! They only sought permission to retire. He looked wistfully into their faces one by one when they passed out, as though to see which way the greater number leant. But that was fruitless. The gaoler touched him on the shoulder. He followed mechanically to the end of the dock and sat down on a chair. The man pointed it out, or he would not have seen it. He looked up into the gallery again. Some of the people were eating, and some fanning themselves with handkerchiefs, for the crowded place was very hot. There was one young man sketching his face in a little notebook. He wondered whether it was like, and looked on when the artist broke his pencil point, and made another with his knife, as any idle spectator might have done. In the same way, when he turned his eyes towards the judge, his mind began to busy itself with the fashion of his dress, and what it cost, and how he put it on. There was an old fat gentleman on the bench, too, who had gone out some half an hour before, and now come back. He wondered within himself whether this man had been to get his dinner, and what he had had, and where he had had it, and pursued this train of careless thought until some new object caught his eye and roused another. Not that all this time his mind was for an instant free from one oppressive, overwhelming sense of the grave that opened at his feet. It was ever present to him, but in a vague and general way,
and he could not fix his thoughts upon it. Thus, even while he trembled and turned burning hot at the idea of speedy death, he fell to counting the iron spikes before him, and wondering how the head of one had been broken off, and whether they would mend it or leave it as it was. Then he thought of all the horrors of the gallows and the scaffold, and stopped to watch a man sprinkling the floor to cool it, and then went on to think again. At length there was a cry of silence, and a breathless look from all towards the door. The jury returned and passed him close. He could glean nothing from their faces. They might as well have been of stone. Perfect stillness ensued, not a rustle, not a breath. Guilty. The building rang with a tremendous shout, and another, and then it echoed loud groans that gathered strength as they swelled out like angry thunder. It was a peal of joy from the populace outside, greeting the news that he would die on Monday. The noise subsided, and he was asked if he had anything to say why sentence of death should not be passed upon him. He had resumed his listening attitude, and looked intently at his questioner while the demand was made, but it was twice repeated before he seemed to hear it, and then he only muttered that he was an old man, an old man, an old man, and so, dropping into a whisper, was silent again. The judge assumed the black cap, and the prisoner stood still with the same air and gesture. A woman in the gallery uttered some exclamation, called forth by this dread solemnity. He looked hastily up, as if angry at the interruption, and bent forward yet more attentively. The address was solemn and impressive, the silence fearful to hear. But he stood like a marble figure without the motion of a nerve. His haggard face was still thrust forward, his under jaw hanging down, and his eyes staring out before him, when the gaoler put his hand upon his arm and beckoned him away. He gazed stupidly about him for an instant, and obeyed. They led him through a paved room under the court, where some prisoners were waiting till their turns came, and others were talking to their friends, who crowded round a grate which looked into the open yard. There was nobody there to speak to him, but as he passed, the prisoners fell back to render him more visible to the people who were clinging to the bars, and they assailed him with opprobrious names, and screeched and hissed. He shook his fist, and would have spat upon them, but his conductors hurried him on, through a gloomy passage lighted by a few dim lamps, into the interior of the prison. Here he was searched, that he might not have about him the means of anticipating the law. This ceremony performed, they led him to one of the condemned cells, and left him there alone. He sat down on a stone bench opposite the door, which served for seat and bedstead, and casting his bloodshot eyes upon the ground, tried to collect his thoughts. After a while he began to remember a few disjointed fragments of what the judge had said, though it had seemed to him at the time that he could not hear a word. These gradually fell into their proper places, and by degrees suggested more, so that in a little time he had the whole almost as it was delivered. To be hanged by the neck till he was dead. That was the end. To be hanged by the neck till he was dead. As it came on very dark, he began to think of all the men he had known who had died upon the scaffold, some of them through his means. They rose up in such quick succession that he could hardly count them. He had seen some of them die, and had joked too, because they died with prayers upon their lips. With what a rattling noise the drop went down, and how suddenly they changed from strong and vigorous men to dangling heaps of clothes. Some of them might have inhabited that very cell, sat upon that very spot. It was very dark. Why didn't they bring a light? The cell had been built for many years. Scores of men must have passed their last hours there. It was like sitting in a vault strewn with dead bodies, the cap, the noose, the pinioned arms, the faces that he knew, even beneath that hideous veil. Light, light. At length, when his hands were raw with beating against the heavy door and walls, two men appeared, one bearing a candle which he thrust into an iron candlestick fixed against the wall, the other dragging in a mattress on which to pass the night, for the prisoner was to be left alone no more. Then came the night, dark, dismal, silent night. Other watchers are glad to hear this church clock strike, for they tell of life and coming day. To him they brought despair. The boom of every iron bell came laden with one deep hollow sound, death. What availed the noise and bustle of cheerful morning which penetrated even there to him? It was another form of knell, with mockery added to the warning. The day passed off. Day! There was no day. It was gone as soon as it came, and night came on again. Night so long and yet so short, long in its dreadful silence and short in its fleeting hours. At one time he raved and blasphemed, at another he howled and tore his hair. Venerable men of his own persuasion had come to pray beside him, but he had driven them away with curses. They renewed their charitable efforts, and he beat them off. Saturday night. He had only one night more to live, and as he thought of this, the day broke. Sunday. It was not until the night of this last awful day that a withering sense of his helpless, desperate state came in its full intensity upon his blighted soul. Not that he had ever held any defined or positive hope of mercy, but that he had never been able to consider more than the dim probability of dying so soon. He had spoken little to either of the two men, who relieved each other in their attendance upon him, and they, for their parts, made no effort to rouse his attention. He had sat there awake, but dreaming. Now he started up every minute, and with gasping mouth and burning skin hurried to and fro, in such a paroxysm of fear and wrath that even they, used to such sights, recoiled from him with horror. He grew so terrible at last, in all the tortures of his evil conscience, that one man could not bear to sit there eyeing him alone, so the two kept watch together. He cowered down upon his stone bed, and thought of the past. He had been wounded with some missiles from the crowd on the day of his capture, and his head was bandaged with a linen cloth. His red hair hung down upon his bloodless face, his beard was torn and twisted into knots, his eyes shone with a terrible light, his unwashed flesh cracked with the fever that burnt him up. 8, 9, 10, if it was not a trick to frighten him, and those were the real hours treading on each other's heels, where would he be when they came round again? 11. Another struck before the voice of the previous hour had ceased to vibrate. At 8 he would be the only mourner in his own funeral train. At 11. Those dreadful walls of Newgate, which have hidden so much misery and such unspeakable anguish, not only from the eyes, but too often and too long from the thoughts of men, never held so dread a spectacle as that. The few who lingered as they passed and wondered what the man was doing who was to be hanged to-morrow would have slept but ill that night if they could have seen him. From early in the evening until early midnight, little groups of 2 and 3 presented themselves at the lodge gate, and inquired with anxious faces whether any reprieve had been received. These, being answered in the negative, communicated the welcome intelligence to clusters in the street, who pointed out to one another the door from which he must come out, and showed where the scaffold would be built, and, walking with unwilling steps away, turned back to conjure up the scene. By degrees they fell off one by one, and for an hour in the dead of night the street was left to solitude and darkness. The space before the prison was cleared, and a few strong barriers, painted black, had been already thrown across the road to break the pressure of the expected crowd, when Mr. Brownlow and Oliver appeared at the wicket, and presented an order of admission to the prisoner, signed by one of the sheriffs. They were immediately admitted into the lodge.
"Is this young gentleman to come too, sir?" said the man whose duty it was to conduct them. "It's not a sight for children, sir."
"It is not indeed, my friend," rejoined Mr. Brownlow, "but my business with this man is intimately connected with him, and as this child has seen him in the full career of his success in villainy, I think it is well, even at the cost of some pain and fear, that he should see him now." These few words had been said apart, so as to be inaudible to Oliver. The man touched his hat, and glancing at Oliver with some curiosity, opened another gate, opposite to that by which they had entered, and led them on through dark and winding ways towards the cells.
"This," said the man, stopping in a large passage, where a couple of workmen were making some preparations in profound silence, "this is the place he passes through. If you step this way you can see the door he goes out at."
He led them into a stone kitchen, fitted with coppers for dressing the prison food, and pointed to a door. There was an open grating above it, through which came the sound of men's voices, mingled with the noise of hammering and the throwing down of boards. They were putting up the scaffold. From this place they passed through several strong gates, opened by other turnkeys from the inner side, and having entered an open yard, ascended a flight of narrow steps and came into a passage with a row of strong doors on the left hand. Motioning them to remain where they were, the turnkey knocked at one of these with his bunch of keys. The two attendants, after a little whispering, came out into the passage, stretching themselves as if glad of the temporary relief, and motioned the visitors to follow the gaoler into the cell. They did so. The condemned criminal was seated on his bed, rocking himself from side to side, with a countenance more like that of a snared beast than the face of a man. His mind was evidently wandering to his old life, for he continued to mutter, without appearing conscious of their presence otherwise than as part of his vision.
"Good boy, Charlie. Well done," he mumbled. "Oliver too. Ha ha! Oliver too. Quite the gentleman now. Quite the... Take that boy away to bed."
The gaoler took the disengaged hand of Oliver, and whispering him not to be alarmed, looked on without speaking.
"Take him away to bed," cried Fagin. "Do you hear me, some of you? He has been somehow the cause of all this. It's worth the money to bring him up to it. Bolt his throat, Bill. Never mind the girl. Bolt his throat as deep as you can cut. Saw his head off."
"Fagin," said the gaoler.
"That's me,"
cried the Jew, falling instantly into the attitude of listening he had assumed upon his trial.
"An old man, my lord. A very old man."
"Here," said the turnkey, laying his hand upon his breast to keep him down. "Here's somebody wants to see you. To ask you some questions, I suppose. Fagin, are you a man?"
"I shan't be one long,"
he replied, looking up with a face retaining no human expression but rage and terror.
"Strike 'em all dead. What right have they to butcher me?"
As he spoke he caught sight of Oliver and Mr. Brownlow. Shrinking to the furthest corner of the seat, he demanded to know what they wanted there. "Steady," said the turnkey, still holding him down. "Now, sir, tell him what you want. Quick, if you please, for he grows worse as the time goes on." "You have some papers," said Mr. Brownlow, advancing, "which were placed in your hands for better security by a man called Monks."
"It's a lie together," replied Fagin. "I haven't one, not one."
"For the love of God," said Mr. Brownlow solemnly, "do not say that now, upon the very verge of death, but tell me where they are. You know that Sikes is dead, that Monks has confessed, that there is no hope of any further gain. Where are those papers?"
"Oliver," cried
Fagin, beckoning to him.
Here, let me whisper to you."
"I am not afraid," said Oliver in a low voice, as he relinquished Mr. Brownlow's hand.
"The papers," said Fagin, drawing Oliver towards him, "are in a canvas bag, in a hole a little way up the chimney in the top front room. I want to talk to you, my dear. I want to talk to you."
Yes," returned Oliver. "Let me say a prayer. Do let me say one prayer. Say only one, upon your knees with me, and we will talk till morning."
Outside," replied Fagin, pushing the boy before him towards the door, and looking vacantly over his head. "Say I've gone to sleep. They'll believe you. You can get me out if you take me so. Now then."
"Oh, God forgive this wretched man!" cried the boy, with a burst of tears.
That's right, said Fagin. "That'll help us on. This door first. If I shake and tremble as we pass the gallows, don't you mind, but hurry on. Now.
"Have you nothing else to ask him, sir?" inquired the turnkey. "No other question," replied Mr. Brownlow. "If I hoped we could recall him to a sense of his position—" "Nothing will do that, sir," replied the man, shaking his head. "You had better leave him." The door of the cell opened, and the attendants returned.
Press on, cried Fagin. Softly, but not too slow. Faster.
The men laid hands upon him, and disengaging Oliver from his grasp, held him back. He struggled with the power of desperation for an instant, and then sent up cry upon cry that penetrated even those massive walls, and rang in their ears until they reached the open yard. It was some time before they left the prison. Oliver nearly swooned after this frightful scene, and was so weak that for an hour or more he had not the strength to walk. Day was dawning when they again emerged. A great multitude had already assembled, The windows were filled with people, smoking and playing cards to beguile the time. The crowd were pushing, quarrelling, joking. Everything told of life and animation but one dark cluster of objects in the centre of all—the black stage, the cross-beam, the rope, and all the hideous apparatus of death. End of chapter 52. Chapter 53 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. And last. The fortunes of those who have figured in this tale are nearly closed. The little that remains to their historian to relate is told in few and simple words. Before 3 months had passed, Rose Fleming and Harry Maylie were married in the village church, which was henceforth to be the scene of the young clergyman's labours. On the same day they entered into possession of their new and happy home. Mrs. Maylie took up her abode with her son and daughter-in-law, to enjoy during the tranquil remainder of her days the greatest felicity that age and worth can know, the contemplation of the happiness of those on whom the warmest affections and tenderest cares of a well-spent life have been unceasingly bestowed. It appears on full and careful investigation that if the wreck of property remaining in the custody of Monks, which had never prospered in either his hands or those of his mother, were equally divided between himself and Oliver, it would yield to each little more than £3,000. By the provisions of his father's will, Oliver would have been entitled to the whole, but Mr. Brownlow, unwilling to deprive the elder son of the opportunity of retrieving his former vices and pursuing an honest career, proposed this mode of distribution, to which his young charge joyfully acceded. Monks, still bearing that assumed name, retired with his portion to a distant part of the new world, where, having quickly squandered it, he once more fell into his old courses, and, after undergoing a long confinement for some fresh act of fraud and knavery, at length sunk under an attack of his old disorder, and died in prison. As far from home died the chief remaining members of his friend Fagin's gang. Mr. Brownlow adopted Oliver as his son, removing with him and the old housekeeper to within a mile of the parsonage house, where his dear friends resided. He gratified the only remaining wish of Oliver's warm and earnest heart, and thus linked together a little society, whose condition approached as nearly to one of perfect happiness as can ever be known in this changing world. Soon after the marriage of the young people, the worthy doctor returned to Chertsey, where, bereft of the presence of his old friends, he would have been discontented if his temperament had admitted of such a feeling, and would have turned quite peevish if he had known how. For 2 or 3 months he contented himself with hinting that he feared the air began to disagree with him. Then, finding that the place really no longer was to him what it had been, he settled his business on his assistant, took a bachelor's cottage outside the village of which his young friend was pastor, and instantaneously recovered. Here he took to gardening, planting, fishing, carpentering, and various other pursuits of a similar kind, all undertaken with his characteristic impetuosity. In each and all he has since become famous throughout the neighbourhood as a most profound authority. Before his removal he had managed to contract a strong friendship for Mr. Grimwig, which that eccentric gentleman cordially reciprocated. He is accordingly visited by Mr. Grimwig a great many times in the course of the year. On all such occasions Mr. Grimwig plants, fishes, and carpenters with great ardour, doing everything in a very singular and unprecedented manner, but always maintaining with his favourite asseveration that his mode is the right one. On Sundays he never fails to criticise the sermon to the young clergyman's face, always informing Mr. Losburn in strict confidence afterwards that he considers it an excellent performance, but deems it as well not to say so. It is a standing and very favourite joke for Mr. Brownlow to rally him on his old prophecy concerning Oliver, and to remind him of the night on which they sat with the watch between them waiting his return. But Mr. Grimwig contends that he was right in the main, and in proof thereof remarks that Oliver did not come back after all, which always calls forth a laugh on his side, and increases his good humour. Mr. Noah Claypole, receiving a free pardon from the Crown in consequence of being admitted a prover against Fagin, and considering his profession not altogether as safe a one as he could wish, was for some little time at a loss for a means of a livelihood, not burdened with too much work. After some consideration he went into business as an informer, in which calling he realizes a genteel subsistence. His plan is to walk out once a week during church time, attended by Charlotte in respectable attire. The lady faints away at the doors of charitable publicans, and the gentleman, being accommodated with threepenny worth of brandy to restore her, lays an information next day, and pockets half the penalty. Sometimes Mr. Claypole faints himself, but the result is the same. Mr. and Mrs. Bumble, deprived of their situations, were gradually reduced to great indigence and misery, and finally become paupers in that very same workhouse in which they had once lorded it over others. Mr. Bumble has been heard to say that in this reverse and degradation he has not even spirits to be thankful for being separated from his wife. As to Mr. Giles and Brittles, they still remain in their old posts, although the former is bald and the last named boy quite grey. They sleep at the parsonage, but divide their attention so equally among its inmates, and Oliver and Mr. Brownlow and Mr. Losburn, that to this day the villagers have never been able to discover to which establishment they properly belong. Master Charley Bates, appalled by Sikes's crime, fell into a train of reflection whether an honest life was not, after all, the best. Arriving at the conclusion that it certainly was, he turned his back upon the scenes of the past, resolved to amend it in some new sphere of action. He struggled hard, and suffered much for some time, but having a contented disposition and a good purpose, succeeded in the end. And from being a farmer's drudge and a carrier's lad, he is now the merriest young grazier in all Northamptonshire. And now the hand that traces these words falters as it approaches the conclusion of its task, and would weave for a little space longer the thread of these adventures. I would fain linger yet with a few of those among whom I have so long moved, and share their happiness by endeavouring to depict it. I would show Rose Maylie in all the bloom and grace of early womanhood, shedding on her secluded path of life soft and gentle light, that fell on all who trod it with her, and shone into their hearts. I would paint her the life and joy of the fireside circle and the lively summer group. I would follow her through the sultry fields at noon, and hear the low tones of her sweet voice in the moonlit evening walk. I would watch her in all her goodness and charity abroad, and the smiling, untiring discharge of domestic duties at home. I would paint her and her dead sister's child happy in their love for one another, and passing whole hours together in picturing the friends whom they had so sadly lost. I would summon before me once again those joyous little faces that clustered round her knee, and listen to their merry prattle. I would recall the tones of that clear laugh, and conjure up the sympathizing tear that glistened in the soft blue eye. These, and 1,000 looks and smiles, and turns of thought and speech, I would fain recall them every one. How Mr. Brownlow went on from day to day, filling the mind of his adopted child with stores of knowledge, and becoming attached to him more and more as his nature developed itself, and showed the thriving seeds of all he wished him to become. How he traced in him new traits of his early friend, that wakened in his own bosom old remembrances, melancholy and yet sweet and soothing. How the two orphans, tried by adversity, remembered its lessons in mercy to others, and mutual love and fervent thanks to him who had protected and preserved them. These are all matters which need not be told. I have said that they were truly happy, and without strong affection and humanity of heart, and gratitude to that being whose code is mercy, and whose great attribute is benevolence to all things that breathe, happiness can never be attained. Within the altar of the old village church there stands a white marble tablet, which bears as yet but one word, Agnes. There is no coffin in that tomb, and may it be many, many years before another name is placed above it. But if the spirits of the dead ever come back to earth to visit spots hallowed by the love beyond the grave, of those whom they knew in life, I believe that the shade of Agnes sometimes hovers round that solemn nook. I believe it none the less because that nook is in a church, and she was weak and erring. End of chapter 53. That is the end of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens.